So as I was preparing to write this paper, I came across a provocative book by Canadian journalist and author Andrew Nikiforok, The Energy of Slaves, Oil and the New Servitude. It wasn't the first time I encountered the term energy slaves. Ivan Illich, writing in 1974, had used the same term in his slim but insightful volume, Energy and Equity, grappling even as early as then with the inevitable problem of inequity that arises once energy use and production reaches a certain threshold. Nikiforok, for his part, makes the claim that underneath contemporary modern humans' relationship with energy is a master-slave dynamic, no different than that of the monarchies in the Middle Ages, whose opulent lifestyles were enabled by the muscle power of hundreds of thousands of laboring human and animal slaves. Contrary to the notion that we have now finally done away with slavery, given that we now have all these industrial machines doing the laboring for us, Nikiforok argues that our settled, convenient, richly resourced lifestyles that we've come to take for granted in our modern world, and to which the poor are constantly urged to aspire to, are in fact just as dependent on the energy of slaves, if not more so, only now in the form of coal, oil, and natural gas, not to mention the human muscle power that is still ubiquitous in sweatshops, plantations, mining, and some of the most dangerous extractive operations of industrial production around the globe. There are no winners in this game, Nikiforok asserts. Certainly not for the slave, whose degradation is stark, but neither for the master, whose ultimate loss of freedom and gross dependency on the slave makes him lazy, unhealthy, dumb, and unskilled in the basics of survival. I open with this reference, given that one of the challenges in grappling with the theme of liberation is first gaining a clear sense of the nature of our enslavement. The question, liberation from what, demands that we first recognize as starkly as possible our condition of captivity, to make visible the bars of the holding cell that incarcerates us. This is hard to do when the very condition of captivity has now become, in our modern world, coterminous with human life itself. Without recognizing the aberrant nature of our condition as modern humans, having erased from memory the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, when we lived very differently as a species on the planet, when confronted with the apocalypse of collapse and extinction, our well-trained instincts are likely to make us cling to our chains even more tightly rather than breaking free. Cultural theorist Fred Moten once remarked in an interview, and I quote, "Anybody who thinks they can come even close to understanding how terrible the terror has been without understanding how beautiful the beauty has been against the grain of the terror is wrong," unquote. Where I would normally go with this admonition is straight into the witness of the beauty of that erased historical memory, the hundreds of thousands of years of land-rooted living that has been the womb of my own liberation and gestation into a different kind of human being, an autobiographical accounting of which will ground the longer version of this narration. But the construct energy slaves, for me, makes such a stark and powerful depiction of what lies underneath our invented civilized existence that I believe it would horrify enough were we to understand its true nature, even without yet comprehending the beauty that such is bringing to annihilation everywhere it lands. Contrary to its great PR campaign as the shining evolutionary achievement of our species, what we learn is that civilization is in fact a Moloch, demanding the sacrifice not just of humans, but of the entire planet, the technocracy in charge of powering the slave system, unbounded in its insatiable appetite for more. As 19th century legal scholar Charles Solomon wrote, "No word is more vague and has permitted the commission of more crimes than that of civilization," unquote. In this paper then will be a two-pronged probing. The first into the cultural logic of an energy slave system that in my own life has shown up as a colonizing regime, one that I now see is responsible for introducing into the world a dynamic of restlessness and instability into what has heretofore been a largely relatively stable equilibrium prior to settlement and civilization building. And on the other, the constant press of natural peoples, i.e., those living a very different ethic of relation to the wild, to return to balance, to keep the cycle of life going, their practice of beauty making a discipline they keep as a form of repayment of the debt owed to the natural world for nurturing them and as a way of feeding and keeping life alive. The writing here then will meander through my story of colonial subjection, growing up, to the epistemic terror of the civilizational mandate as introduced to our people by Christian Protestantism with its ethic of hard work and ceaseless striving, else one wasn't deemed human enough, and by its modern secularized version of Western progress, advancement, and growth. I note that the gaze cast by both traditions has had the effect of reproducing a once thriving people as Filipinos, as lazy, indolent, lacking in motive power, and easily content. The unnamed frame of reference being what historian William McNeill characterizes as the restless instability constituting the, quote, true uniqueness of Western civilization, unquote. Needless to say, our national elite were a quick study, setting out post-independence to create a modern progressive nation state, convinced of the utter necessity of weaning ourselves away from our curse of easy contentment, what Nick Joaquin, one of our renowned Filipino writers, termed as the bane of our, quote, heritage of smallness, unquote, a subsistence-prone sensibility that has kept us from striving for more, suggesting that it's high time we got over the insults of our colonized past. The same writer urges us to marvel instead at the incredible opportunity afforded us, that is, the compelling of our native physique, psyche, and personality to undergo revolutionary and evolutionary change that otherwise would have been imprisoned in a timeless, unchanging state of fixity. As I wrote elsewhere, Europe in this discourse is represented as the Hegelian dynamic that propels a languorous, self-content, and unmotivated people to fulfill their spirit and their destiny. In concrete terms, it means being driven by the colonial impetus to diligence and progress as realized in the mastery of nature, the development of technology, and the ceaseless production and accumulation of material wealth. Thanks to European colonization, the prehistoric Filipino managed to transform himself into a modern, rational human being through the introduction of the tools of civilization, a ragtag group of tribal folk living in isolation from each other gained identity as a nation, attaining economic transformation from a subsistence culture to the first world economy of modern times. I, on the other hand, would argue that it is this hankering for more that is in fact the curse, the inability to countenance what antique peoples have always known, that life is ultimately not about us, but about this sacred mystery that some call the holy in nature. And the task is to maintain balance by observing the ritual courtesy of not taking anything without giving something back. Indigenous writer Martin Prechtel warns that attempting to strike a better bargain than this makes a culture murderous, such as in the case of our highly technologized culture, where inventions take from the earth but give nothing in return, noting, and I quote, with every invention comes a spiritual debt that must be paid, either ritually or else taken out of us in warfare, grief, or depression, unquote. This is what the ritual way of living is about, the devoting of a certain percentage of the spiritual economy to feeding the holy in nature, whether in the form of eloquent speech, a gift made by hand, or beautiful grieving in gratitude to her who keeps life alive in the world. It is for this reason that land-rooted cultures typically orient their energies toward other than surplus production and material accumulation, not only to avoid incurring heavy indebtedness to the earth, but because they elaborate meaning elsewhere. Practel speaks of one native Mayan village in Guatemala, and I quote, "The Chutuhil were not trying to build an unsuffering world. The world they were part of was not run by humans, and it had only live things residing in it. There were no dead things. Instead of eradicating all the misery of the world, the Chutuhil were trying to suffer together creatively in a beautiful way to keep their world of delicately balanced live things more vital by feeding it the grief of their human failures and stupidity. These failures were made beautiful by the ornate and graceful way the people dedicated their suffering to the earth and to that which made life live in a proven ritual attitude of great antiquity," unquote. Nikiforok locates the crisis of our time, not in diminishing energy resources or even in the threat of climate change, for which it may be argued that the solution is simply finding low carbon emitting green energy alternatives that could keep the party going, but rather in the damnable master-slave dynamic at the heart of our relationship with the natural world, one that has effectively turned the earth and her beings into our minions with a blowback now coming back to bite us. Confronted with the direness of our predicament, the question I pose in this paper is no longer how to save us, but how to recognize the terror in our heavily indebted lifestyle of ease and comfort that most have disastrously declared non-negotiable. How to find ways to metabolize such terror into tear-soaked offerings of grief and sorrow that can birth new desires and new understandings is the challenge. The relearning once more of the ancient art of beauty making that alone feeds the holy in nature. It is the compelling call I hear from the teachings of all antique peoples around the globe. Beleaguered on every side, they resolutely say, even to the end, even if we don't make it, we keep making beauty anyway. Thank you.
I will start with Lily's paper, and I like the language. I like the language from the abstract, but I also like the language from the presentation. I think Michael has touched on some of this beautiful language, but I liked also the construct of the energy slaves, and I think this is a good position to view liberation theology from, being enslaved to energy. And I think it goes even beyond our thinking. It goes even beyond what you mentioned, because this machine which needs this energy continues. There are still communities which have not been touched yet. I think from one of the spotlight speakers earlier, we got how the seabed is explored. I know in Southern Africa, we still have possible oil and gas, which the multinationals are still targeting. And I liked the fact that you were talking about going back to the knowledge of the indigenous peoples, and I like the idea that it is still there, because I think on day one that was one of the questions I think that I had in one of the presentations, that people or peoples, indigenous peoples or oppressed peoples, do have some of this knowledge and they keep it, but where individually or as communities. But I like when you talk about in your own context, the making of beauty instead of making more. Although my question then is, are we able to resist because as you were talking, I realized that now maybe we become energy, and the whole capitalist structure makes us voluntary slaves. At least that's what I was thinking, because I know like labor migration, as there are people, we move across the world because of the system itself, to look for enslaving jobs which are, you know, that there's the longing always for hope, longing for home, longing for the peace, longing for that connection with the earth, which is not usually there when we are enslaved. So that is a question, actually. Like, is it possible to get off the machine? Because we are part of this machine. Is it really possible to get off it? Does it stop? Once you are on it, does it stop? I think I'll stop it there, although there's a lot I could say, but I think Michael has touched on some of it.
Thank you, Shingi, for the very deep and thoughtful response. I'm deeply honored. Thank you. And you ask a very profound question. Is it possible to get off the machine? And I would say that the reason why I focused on a two-pronged move, uh, I don't think it is possible for us to get off the machine unless we understand that we do need to get off the machine, right? Because even as we speak, so many are still don't understand the nature of our captivity in our modern civilized living, and fundamentally it has something to do with our disconnection from the sacredness, the sacred relationship with the natural world. And to the extent that our theologies fail to address this disconnect, right? Where you always posit a transcendent God. And so among my students, for example, they are very fearful of even venturing into the sacrality of when I ask them, for example, to do this little exercise of going to a place in nature, but asking permission, because you're entering the territories of all these living beings, then they're afraid they're being heretical because they're Christian. I'm Christian, you know. Isn't that idolatrous? I think this is the fundamental problem we face. But in terms of getting off the machine, until we see an alternative vision of what life is about, we will just keep going. That's why, for me, my transformation is really encountering the amazing worldview of our indigenous peoples. It's not that they are any more virtuous than us, but it is because they understand that their primary relationship is with the holy, with the sacred in nature. And therefore, it is to them that I find the most necessary pedagogy, tutelage, I would say, because they still remember what it means, right? To have this original agreement, as many would call it, that you don't take anything without offering something back. And if you had to do that with everything that we possess, right? Like a knife, our indigenous teacher says, may seem so simple, but in order to make a knife, you have to make an offering to the fire. You have to make an offering when you extract the iron from the ore, every step of the way. That's why it's not because they're not capable of inventing backhoes and shopping malls or space shuttles, but it's because to live in this way means not wanting to be heavily indebted. You have to make an offering. That is the ritual. I realize that that is the ritual way of living.